Okay, good morning. We've just cracked past 50 attendees, so I think we can probably start our session now. Good morning, my name is Werner Pyke. Thank you very much to everyone who's attending the session. Our topic today will be open banking, are we living the dream? And we are very pleased to have three panelists with us today representing many years of experience. And so my role today will be to facilitate the conversation. And we are hoping to have a very productive discussion around open banking with our panelists. So brief introductions. We have with us today, firstly, Kevin Brown, who is a United Kingdoms-based consultant with many decades of experience and has been part of the United Kingdom's open banking journey for a very long time now. Kevin then also serves on several boards and committees within the UK space, including bodies related to the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority. Good morning, Kevin, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
And then also with us today, a person who many of our attendees probably would know well by now, Bishen Kumalo. Bishen heads up modernization in South Africa at BankservAfrica. Good morning, Bishen.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here.
And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, we're also very pleased to then have a representative from one of South Africa's major participant banks from Nedbank. Chipo Mushwana leads the Emerging Payments and Innovation team at Nedbank. Good morning, Chipo, and welcome.
Good morning. Pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right. So our topic today is open banking. In previous years, the same conference has had multiple sessions related to open banking. So today, our goal is not to rerun any of those sessions. So we're not going to be doing a primer to what open banking is. More specifically, now that open banking has been implemented in multiple jurisdictions internationally, we much rather today want to be talking about what is the progress and the learnings from those implementations been. And then very particularly, we want to bring it back to South Africa's own modernization journey in terms of what can the South African payment fraternity and industry take from those learnings, and where does it guide us in terms of our own modernization journey. So we're going to be discussing several of the open banking initiatives globally, some of them only very briefly. Primarily, we're going to be talking quite a lot about the UK open banking experience because we have Kevin's expertise that we can lean on in that. And also because in a classic open banking perspective, the UK is probably one of the jurisdictions that's made the most progress since its inception. But we're also going to just touch very briefly on some of the other international cases, some of which may or may not be viewed as classic open banking, but certainly as then faced perhaps some of the similar challenges or achieved some of the similar successes. So that will be our session today. Now, starting with particularly the UK open banking experience. So by my count, as I have it, Kevin, it's now been 7 years since the forming of the first open banking working group in the UK and 4 years since the launch of open banking within the UK. And so that means that there should by now be quite a bit of learnings and data available on in terms of how that's been adopted. So Kevin, can you perhaps start us off and just give us a sense in the last 4 years, open banking in the United Kingdom, has it been embraced by the public?
Interesting question. I think if you ask the public in the UK about open banking, they would look at you quizzically because it's not a term that they would recognise. I think it's fair to say, us at industry level in banks and fintechs all recognise the term open banking or open finance as it's becoming more commonly looked at as we broaden the sort of area and the service levels. but the public aren't interested in open banking per se. What they're interested in is the propositions that they get and how seamless those propositions are. So I think, for me, the journey that we've been on in the UK has been interesting. I listened to the very first session today at the conference about the modernisation journey that South Africa's on, and I think there's some very interesting similarities in terms of things that are happening, the changes of the organisations that represent payments, and also the inclusion of a broader stakeholder group, which are very important. We've also got to view open banking as part of a big modernisation programme that started with faster payments, and real time is a very key enabler to open banking. And I think you've got to bear that in mind as you look at the services that are being offered. But it's not just about faster payments. It's about new services coming alongside that with data, the ISO 20022, request to pay, digital ID, and also some of the services that protect consumers as well. So, and we'll maybe touch on those later. But I think just in terms of observations on the journey, it's been a slow burn, partly because it's complicated and it's difficult, but also because it means networks working together to deliver the services. And it's interesting, there's some similarities with the way FPS was developed in the UK, because banks have got different choices about how they play. And those banks that have been strategic about open banking and seen it as a real opportunity to build and enhance their business are the ones that have been on the forefront of new apps and services, whereas those that have viewed it as a regulatory requirement and have done what they need to do are the ones that now are looking at how they might take the next step and are perhaps slightly behind in terms of services. Just in terms of some statistics, because I know everybody likes their statistics, the latest newsletter from the open banking industry body said we've got 327 regulated entities, regulated providers. A lot of those are third-party providers, 234 of those, but just short of 100 are regulated entities, so banks, effectively, and financial institutions. The thing to bear in mind is that the volumes are slowly increasing, and key stats really to look at are things like API calls. So I think the latest sort of running total is around 800 million API calls a month. And that is starting to grow. And that's off the back of just good customer propositions. And I think, that's the key to success. And maybe, as we go forward and discuss this in more detail, it's those customer propositions that drive, the growth and the usage going forward.
And so maybe then along those lines, one more question before we move to our South African panelist, Kevin, is, so volumes are growing. There's also then recently been an increase in the transaction value limit that's allowed to, and a number that I saw was that it's now £250,000 is the limit. Has there been growth in transaction values as well, along with the volume growth?
Again, I think you've got to look at this as, and this comes back to the customer view of, do customers understand open banking? This is about individual propositions. And within individual propositions, that value marker is important for some, but not for others. So I think the interesting one for me is that we saw, particularly in the last 2 years, a number of new services replacing card top-up services. So this is using open banking to top up or move money between your accounts that used to be done via maybe MasterCard or Visa, and are now being done by the open banking service. So in those instances, and particularly where that might involve moving of investment monies, for example, the value limit becomes quite important, but the volume of transactions in that area are pretty low. So I think it's looking at it in context. The really powerful services that are being used very regularly are those that, for instance, in the business market, integrate your bank services with your ERP provider. So you're getting your invoice information, payment data, all integrated into one app. And that's making sort of, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, life very easy to operate, and is saving them lots of money. So I think individually things like the payment limit is important for some services, but it's helpful just to understand all the different opportunities for innovation that exist within the open banking framework.
Mm-hmm. And so then, speaking about opportunities for innovation, Bishen, from your perspective, what are the metrics that you, as you watch these open banking initiatives across the world, what are the metrics for you that you feel are the ones that you really watch?
It would be, hi everyone, it would be, I think, on the uptake, as Kevin has said, of the increase in use and by the consumers. One of the first questions you asked, Kevin, is how are consumers perceiving open banking? And his answer was, consumers are not aware of the services, the underlying capabilities around open banking, but rather benefiting from the underlying services. And I think South Africa is in a very unique environment in terms of our banking use and utilization, and also speaks to the problems that we are looking to address in this ecosystem. And some of the problems we're looking to address is, as the earlier panelists were saying, around financial inclusion. And that speaks to different use cases or from an open banking proposition. Things like seamless onboarding, enabling people to enter the financial services ecosystem would be the kind of things that we, from a South Africa perspective, with the unique challenges that we have, will be watching closely. Countries like India, I know we're going to speak about them as well, and how they have facilitated financial transactions through the common sharing of data, using ISO standards in order to enable that integration, as well as coupling with fintechs. And so the metrics that we look at, or that I would look at from a South African perspective, would be those that would enable us to start addressing those unique problems that we as South Africa have, and to replicate some of those services in order to start to get the increase or the adoption of just core banking services for our South African consumers.
And then Chipo, from your perspective, so Kevin made an interesting point earlier where he said that those banks who've seen open banking as an opportunity to enhance their businesses rather than just as another regulatory item seem to have been more successful. So you're uniquely positioned in terms of looking at innovation and emerging payments. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you look for in a successful open banking implementation?
Great. Thank you for that question. And just to build on what Kevin and Bishen have spoken about, I think for me, one of the most critical things that we have to measure is the customer understanding. And it's not an easy thing to measure, but we can probably only measure it based on adoption and the activities in which the customers actually engage with regards to open banking products and services. And I do think that this adoption matrix, for lack of a better word, is really motivated by two things. So the first one being those business objectives and targets. And I guess we can wrap the compliance question around it, and using compliance or regulation as an asset, not just a tick box, but also there's a need to get a better understanding of the customer's financial profile, etc. But also this ambient around innovation, with everyone in finance really being keenly aware of this disruption and really wanting to participate. So I think for me, that at this stage is the most important metric. How do we drive customer understanding, thereby driving customer adoption?
Yes, thank you. And then a little bit later, we were going to touch on some of the thorny issues, perhaps that emerge, some of the more difficult areas. And then I think at that time we can also, there was Bishen mentioned earlier, there have been some obviously adoptions in India, and there's been recently quite a lot of news regarding some of the developments in China and where the regulators had to pull back. And I think we can come back to those. But while we're looking at the positive side of what open banking can do, Kevin, have there been in the UK open banking implementation, have there been some positive, unexpected, unintended occurrences, some delightful things that have happened?
I think it's interesting. If you ask some consumers about individual use cases, I think you will see the delight in terms of the fact that they're not having to rekey information, data is moving seamlessly, and they're getting access to what they see as a better proposition. And that follows through both in terms of retail consumers and business customers as well. The example of the ERP platforms working with the banks to provide a seamless service is something that has been, certainly from many small business customers, a big part of the positive journey that they're seeing. And I think if you couple that, and this comes back to my point around sort of the broader modernisation, if you couple that with things like the emerging use of request to pay, all of these services mashed together to give businesses and consumers a better overall experience. But it is important that you look at individual use cases and understand how those use cases can benefit and who they benefit. And I think one of the challenges that's quite apparent is the mix of different segments and how they benefit. And clearly, where we've got in the UK people with multiple bank accounts, aggregation services have been really beneficial. But again, there is still a focus, quite rightly, on the group of more vulnerable customers and how they might be able to benefit. But I think there, and that comes to your point, Werner, the understanding of open banking and what it means just in terms of propositions is still a challenge in terms of communication.
And so then on the topic of communication, as part of our own journey on modernization, Bishen, and can you speak a little bit about how you think about, perhaps the idea here is that the technology or the terminology matters less than the use case. Can you speak a little bit about how you think about communicating that through to the public?
Definitely. There's a lot of discussions as we look to bring more people onto the financial services ecosystem. I mean, that is some of the problems that, or some of the benefits that Kevin is speaking about from a UK perspective have to be looked at in the context of where the UK is in terms of its use of financial services and where South Africa is and other countries like us, maybe even on the continent and further afield. Some of the challenges that we have is around consumer awareness or consumer training on the benefits of having your data. The benefits, for example, and if I think of a use case, is a use case that we've been thinking about recently with the places where people stay and having to access banking services and that whole last mile bringing banking capabilities to the consumer. And the ability for those consumers to register and then have to come back and register again, let's say for income grants or social grants, and then having to go and register at a financial institution, the ability to share that information in a secure and regulated ecosystem would benefit our consumers. So it's not just about us as participants in the digital financial ecosystem, educating or telling consumers about, you know, the benefits that they could reap, but it's about the practical use cases that enable these communities to access financial services, to be able to pay for goods and services, to be able to take their data once they've registered for, let's say, an identity or a digital identity, and that information is able to be shared around in a secure environment, or the fact that somebody goes and registered for what we call SASSA grants, social income grants in South Africa, and then that information can be accessible to banking institutions so that they can receive their money in digital format. So it's always about looking at where South Africa is from a use and adoption of financial services, and how open banking and sharing of data in a regulated, in a trusted ecosystem could benefit the end consumer. Teaching our consumers about open banking, I would imagine, is possibly less of a benefit to them, but enabling those types of capabilities and services that open banking would provide is probably where, from my perspective, from a modernization perspective, I would focus our efforts on. Werner, I trust that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And then Chipo, Kevin also then mentioned that some of the benefits that the UK saw then tends to also lean towards the small business space, integration of ERP and invoicing and so on. Where do small, I of course, not where do, but how do you think about the small business sector in the context of modernization and digitization and so forth?
So I really do think that it's an important sector that we do need to focus on and enable. I was recently reading an article, I'm sure some of you might know the example of Yolt, which was essentially a PFM sort of tool that allowed users to view their bank accounts and credit cards in one space, etc. But last week, they wound down that sort of customer-facing app to focus on open banking. But when you unpack what they're actually trying to do is they're now focusing on the small businesses. And I do think that that for me is an indication not just of the opportunity that exists there, but the need that sits within these small businesses, particularly if you think about the South African context, and Bishen touched on it as well. We do have some serious socioeconomic challenges, right? And the environment for small businesses to do business in South Africa is not the easiest. So I do think that we have a responsibility as we drive this open banking agenda to really service the small businesses in providing that information, that the transparency that is needed to enable them to reach their dreams, but also to run their businesses on a day-to-day basis as well.
And then it's a very interesting point that you then make about Yolt. And maybe just to wrap the section up to get back to Kevin. So Yolt was an interesting example of an initiative launched by ING Bank, correct? Where ING came back to the UK with Yolt, started out as a consumer focus, has now switched over to a small business focus. Kevin, is it then true that the success in open banking maybe comes after the first pivot? Because it feels like Yolt came in one way, a little bit of a pivot, and is now finding its traction. So should we expect that it needs a bit of a pivot?
Yeah, I guess I have a personal view that says, yeah, in the initial wave of open banking, the use case around aggregation of accounts and consolidation of information from your finances was probably the key proposition, which is why ING came in on that proposition. But actually what's happened here in the UK is virtually all of the mainstream banks can do that as well. So effectively, you know, if you bank with a Barclays or an NatWest, you can easily import your bank details from any other bank account that you've got. So what's happened is people have consolidated into their current relationships. Which in some ways is probably helpful for the current incumbents and not for new challengers in that sense. But actually, you know, some of the big challenger banks have won in that process as well. People like Starling and Monzo have been very successful in that space because they've been providing the bank services alongside the aggregation. I think the other thing that is driving that picture in the UK, and particularly ING's positioning, is there is very little revenue opportunities directly around the consumer market, whereas like many markets, whether you look at the UK or the US, elsewhere, the business market, there is a good opportunity to drive some revenue, and there's real value to the end user. So businesses are prepared to pay. They see the value of these services and how they link together, and therefore it's a win-win on both sides. So I think what you're seeing now is the next level of evolution around revenue opportunities, value propositions, and that spans not just the business market but elsewhere as well. So I think I mentioned earlier the use of open banking as a vehicle to disintermediate card payments, and that's a clear opportunity. People will pay less. The big companies will pay less because they won't be paying for a merchant service charge. They'll be paying a transaction charge. So they're quite keen to do that, but it comes with other challenges because consumers get protection from using their cards. So these things are, you're seeing a sort of a next stage. People are starting to look at how you might insure payments and provide some sort of protection for consumers that way. And that's a challenge for the regulators.
So, and that thing kind of brings me to our next section, which is some of the thornier issues. And so on the topic of consumer protection, it does seem to be an item where, while the UK in its initial launch of open banking did put a lot of thought into data protection and privacy, that there was a gap in terms of its processes around dispute resolution and grievances. Is that true, Kevin? And where is the UK headed now in that regard?
Yeah, it is true. I think in some ways the UK has been helped by the slow take-up and the slow pace of take-up, because I think it's given banks an opportunity particularly to think about fraud protection and services around that. But again, I mean, if you talk to the banks, they are looking at this as just one of many different routes in for fraudsters. And a lot of the challenges are the same for other services. So this is, how do you protect people's account credentials, and how do you verify that the person who's initiating the transaction, whether it's a data transaction or a payment transaction, is who they say they are. Which is why I think, in terms of looking forward, you're going to see much more around and there's just been a consultation in the UK around things like consent dashboards, so you can see what you've agreed to, those sort of services. Plus, you've got continued focus on payment protection in the UK. So we've introduced the confirmation of payee service, and that again is a key part of the protection for consumers, so that they know who they're paying. But the fraudsters have got deep pockets, and it's going to be a continual challenge, I think. But digital ID, as we've touched on, is a big part of that journey as well. And open banking, interestingly, has a part to play in that, because you can use open banking to provide assured credentials as part of that digital ID process.
Mm-hmm. So Bishen, Kevin just said that to some extent he thinks that the UK had a bit of a grace period in terms of that there was some slow adoption prior to the risk and dispute issues hitting. From your perspective, in terms of modernization, how do you think about balancing speed and innovation against consumer trust, processes for handling all of these issues and risk and that sort of thing? So that balancing act, how do you approach it?
It has to be one and the same. If we are delivering capabilities or products that are touching the end consumer, and there's any question of trust or sharing of information for fraudulent purposes, and individuals lose their balances. If we launch any capability in the financial services ecosystem, whether it's with in partnerships with fintechs or with the major banks, risk and trust is critical. Any use or take up that we expect out of these capabilities that we're going to provide on the modernized rails, we are also driving, as BankservAfrica, the Rapid Payments Program, in collaboration with financial services industry, with PASA and various other key players in the financial services ecosystem. And one of the things that we are constantly looking at and evaluating, including reviewing global standards, is how safe our capabilities are, at the flows of information and the opening potential fraud and fraud mitigation. We operate, the more we ask consumers to move away from cash and onto digital ecosystems, the risks that they fear of their monies disappearing or information being shared for nefarious purposes that are impacting them adversely will mean that we will lose those consumers. And coming from the banking sector, we know once you lose a consumer, for any reason, getting them back to utilize the same capability again is exponentially harder. Someone mentioned on the chat that word of mouth in South African ecosystem, in the South African, in any ecosystem counts a lot. If there's any sense that the capabilities that we're providing are not safe or can't be trusted, we won't get use. So for us, the grace period, potentially, even though for the Rapid Payments Program, we're dealing with smaller transaction volumes. But as you know, in our society, losing 100 Rand can be as adverse an impact to someone who's getting a 350 grant from the social grant initiatives. It's a big knock. And so we are not going into any consumer-facing capabilities without ensuring that the capabilities we have will protect the end consumer, and that's the bottom line. There's no grace period for us. We have to ensure that our systems are robust and trusted, and that our end consumers can use them, and we can then encourage that adoption without any regressing due to any breaches of that trust.
And then Chipo, as a representative of a participant bank, do you feel that the existing approach to risk management from a process perspective within a participant bank, or the existing procedures around risk management, do you think that they can keep up with the speed at which something like open banking might put stresses on it?
I have no choice but to say we have to. That's the long and short sort of response to that particular question. And I'm so happy you did ask that question, because too much of the narrative around open banking, as we all know today, is centered around the promise either to delight customers with personalized financial services. And the balanced view around the risks being taken is important. And I think the conversation we're having earlier around customer education or consumer education is important, because these new risks really emerge because of the increased volumes of data, the speed at which we have to process this data as well. And that's why the ecosystem that we find ourselves operating in, involving banks and sort of non-bank industry partners, has to ensure that everybody has the same level of sensitivity towards customer data, right? Banks have the benefit of having done this for decades, right? And we've got systems in place, we've paid the school fees, the costs are catered for. But it's interesting because when you've got new entrants coming into this space, it can be a daunting environment in itself. And I do think that this is where the regulator and everybody that's participating has a role to play in ensuring that we all understand what we need to do, but also that the standards are put in place that we all sort of have to adhere to make sure that it's safe, it's secure. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I always say we digitize for human beings, not for robots. So at the end of the day, whatever services and products we take out into the market must be clear, must be understood and must be consumed, because that is why we are here doing what we are doing today.
Werner, can I just highlight another risk? It's one that doesn't often get a lot of airtime, but I'm sure the people listening, particularly those with a technology background, will be well aware. We're moving into a real-time world, and actually one of the big challenges, and it's a continual challenge, is you continue to operate in that real-time world 24/7, responding to those API requests. So API performance is key, and also, when you look at this, if a consumer or a business uses an open banking service and there is a failure in that API request, or there is a time lag in that API request, that can challenge their continued use of that service. So resilience around your technology delivery of this and your API performance is key to success. The UK was lucky to have the experience of doing faster payments very early, and realizing that consumers now expect their bank to be working 24/7 continually, and the minute something stops, they're immediately on Twitter saying the bank's broken. So the same principles apply to open banking, and I think that's very key to make. It's not just about propositions, it's not just about the services, it's about the underlying technology delivering 24/7 at a speed and a pace that supports the propositions.
Absolutely. So I want to make sure that we leave some time for audience questions, and I see we've got some questions in the chat, and I want to remind the attendees that you can line up if you'd like to ask a question of the panel. But maybe if we can then just kind of finally bring it back home to South Africa, and I'd like to start, Bishen, with yourself and with Chipo. There's seems to be a thread that's run through our conversation, which is that it's really important to understand what the problems are that we're trying to solve, or what the consumer value is that even the small business value that we're trying to deliver. So let's maybe start, Bishen, with you. If you had to help us just focus in on where you see in our modernization journey, especially in the short term, some of those key areas that you feel we need to be solving for within this context, and then leading on from that, Chipo, the same to you, please. But Bishen, starting with you.
The key elements that I think that from a use case perspective that we need to solve for are a lot of the same challenges and a lot of the same objectives that Kevin mentioned. But from my perspective, you look at what is a use case, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for, and what is the environment in which South African consumers are operating in, and how can open banking facilitate or enable them to utilize financial services. It's a big drive for us. We've got a large proportion of consumers that are banked, but equally large sections of our society that, though they may be banked, they are drawing down their balances as soon as they receive them. It's understanding what our ecosystem and our national consumer base, potential consumer base, very heavily cash-based, could benefit from something like open banking. Things like, as Kevin mentioned, from a modernization journey, digital identity, credentials, checkings, identity, and validation, authentication of transactions. It becomes a key important capability and component for us in this ecosystem. Faster payments, we call it rapid payments within the South African ecosystem, also utilizing ISO 2022 and ensuring that we're using modern rails that are interoperable within the financial services ecosystem. So for me, we start with the consumer, we build modernized rails, we provide API services and the relevant API services that our financial services ecosystem is looking at. But part of this modernization journey is also looking at how can Chipo referred to them as non-banking participants or fintechs or other players enter the ecosystem without introducing risks into the ecosystem, but also taking some accountability for some of the obligations that the larger financial institutions have had to put up in terms of the rails. We didn't speak about this, but the cost of maintaining this broad-based ecosystem is large. And so you've got this digital ecosystem that we're looking to modernize digitally, that we're looking to provide capabilities and services, real-time payments to our end consumers. And then it's protecting the consumer throughout these transactions end to end so that we can start to get adoption. The big ticket item for us, or our ultimate goal, our north, is to ensure that South Africa has got a wide use of financial services to benefit South Africans in terms of our ecosystem. So all of these components are all factors that would lead us to increased use of digital ecosystem for the benefit of our consumers, and then again for the benefit of SA Inc. and the country at large. And so it's multifaceted, Werner. I wish it was one answer, but we all have a role to play, including the regulator has a massive role to play in protecting the end consumer, in ensuring and maintaining the ecosystem that we all are contributors towards. There's so many players in this ecosystem, but we need all of us to be playing in this ecosystem and driving towards the same objective. And I can tell you that when we look across the financial services ecosystem, we're all driving towards the same goals. We want South Africa to be a more inclusive financial economy. We want to grow the economy, and we want to do all of these capabilities to ensure that we can.
And then Chipo, do you also see it as a growth engine?
Yes, definitely. And I think Bishen has sort of given the detail behind it. But I think broadly speaking, whether you look at the UK and globally, some of the advanced markets in terms of open banking, whether we're talking about promoting competition, like you said, whether we're talking about digitizing or replacing cash, allowing fintechs to participate, etc., I do think that in the South African context, there are things that we all have to take into consideration. We have an economy that's not growing as fast as we wanted to. We've got the highest Gini coefficient, all these things that are happening around us. And as players within the financial services space, whether it be banks or non-banks, we all have a role to play in promoting this co-opetition and collaboration, which is critical, right, in creating this balanced ecosystem. And that's why the conversation around open banking is important today. But most importantly, digitizing cash. I think those that are involved, obviously, most of us in the RPP program do understand the cost of cash, not just to the customer in terms of safety, etc., but those that handle the cash, banks and everybody else. But the importance of facilitating these quick and cheaper payments is really important in driving that much needed socioeconomic activities that will support the growth of the economy, but most importantly, increase financial participation and inclusion. So it's not just about digitization, but really about bringing it all together, because it is an SA Inc. Story, and we really have to grow the South African economy, and all of us have to participate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We only have a short while, unfortunately, for audience questions, but can I ask tech support? We have 2 people in the queue to ask questions. Tech support, if you could please bring us the, or allow in the first question. Good morning. I wonder whether we perhaps lost that question. Tech support, perhaps we can move. Is there another question? All right. So a quick 5 seconds there. I see that there's been quite a discussion in the chat section that's happened. I think from a time perspective, we are running very close to the end of our session, so we might not be able to get to those questions specifically. But from my side, thank you very much to to our panelists, Chipo to you, Bishen to you, Kevin to you. I really feel like this session, we only scratched the surface in many areas. I'm very pleased to hear that there is such a focus on economic growth that we can get from this, not just as a compliance burden. So thank you very much to everybody, and I hope that some of this discussion was useful to all of our attendees, and that we can continue the discussion in future.